Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is David Silk and I'm the Director of Operations here in the Housing Agency. I'm your chair for this morning's session. This is the fourth day of our national conference and I'm delighted that you can join us and our speakers. Today's session focuses on some of the elements contained within the third pathway of the government's new Housing Plan for Ireland, Housing for All. So over the next hour and a half, we'll be focusing on increasing new housing supply. We've seen year-on-year improvements in new housing supply over the last 10 years, but of course, COVID-19 has been an enormous challenge. Increasing the supply of new homes is therefore crucial and a central aspect of the new plan. Housing for All sets out a target of over 300,000 new homes by 2030. That's an average of about 33,000 new homes each year over the next 9 years in private, affordable and social sectors to meet the needs of people in a wide variety of circumstances. We'd like this session to be as interactive as possible, and so there will be an opportunity to ask questions of our speakers, and we'll ask you to post your questions in the Q&A panel on your screens and to let us know who you'd like your question directed to. If you experience any technical difficulties, try leaving and rejoining, or put tech in the chat box with your issue and we'll follow up with you. Thanks to Gemma, Alex and Tara, who are helping with the technology in the background this morning. This morning, we have three great speakers. Jim Bainham, Director of Delivery here in the Housing Agency, will give an overview of Pathway 3. Rachel Kenny, Director of Planning in Bord Pleanála, will be presenting on planning's role in the delivery of housing. And then we'll call on David Duffy, Director of Property Industry Ireland, who will be presenting on delivering housing for all. So while Jim is getting ready, just to introduce him formally to you. Jim, as I said, is the Director of Delivery here in the Housing Agency. He's a construction economics professional. Jim has extensive experience in the housing sector, having worked with the National Building Agency since 1992 and joining the Housing Agency in 2011. Jim currently has an overarching responsibility for delivery, coordinating a range of actions to support the delivery of social and affordable housing. So I'm going to pass you over to Jim now. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thanks for the introduction there, David, and good morning, everybody. So I'm just going to share my presentation. Okay, so this morning I'm just going to bring you through an overview of Pathway 3. And Pathway 3 is basically, it sets out a number of measures, a range of different measures, which is intended to enable the capacity increase that's required to deliver an average of 33,000 homes per year between now and 2030. I'm going to split it up or break it down in a slightly different way to the way it's done in the actual document. So it focuses on legislative resource and financial infrastructure that's required to deliver the housing over the period. And I'm looking at land management reform, planning reform, activation of state land and also of existing planning permissions, development of the residential construction sector capacity, particularly on the labour side, and also additional funding for housing. So again, the pathway includes a total of 39 actions and 8 policy objectives. And the first of that, or the first area that I'm going to go through is land management reform. So the report makes reference to NESC, or the strategy, the Housing for All makes reference to 3 recent NESC reports and also the Kenny report in relation to land use. And it sets out quite significant changes in the way that land use is intended to be managed going forward. In particular, it sets out a concept of land value sharing. And that would involve the land or the state securing a share of the value uplift that's involved in zoning or designating land for residential development. So it's intended to apply to all new residential zoning, and towards the end of this section, I'll try and make it as clear as I can about how that is intended to work. And we're working in conjunction with a new register of zoned residential development land, which will be prepared by local authorities. It may also include specific mechanisms to deal with or to facilitate land assembly for provision of communal infrastructure. The land value sharing is intended to operate in addition to Part 5 obligations, so it won't be replacing that. The current system of Section 48 and 49 development contributions will remain in place, and they will work side by side for a number of years, but will be gradually replaced by land value sharing as and where it becomes available or applicable. And there will be also complementary measures to secure appropriate levels of contribution in relation to existing zoned land. And effectively, in relation to Section 48 and 49, they will remain in place as they currently are, constructed for a period of at least 6 years. Again, on the area of development or land management, there's the objective of introducing urban development zones. So this takes after the use of strategic development zones, but with a particular focus on regeneration and development of areas, urban areas, which have a capacity to deliver housing. So there would be a development role for the local authority. Sorry, the local authority involved or the LDA. There will be an appraisal stage to identify the suitability of the land before it's zoned. There will be a land value sharing mechanism involved in the urban development zones. It'll be a plan-led approach, and with the concept, or certainly with the objective of giving upfront certainty for both communities involved in that area and also for the development sector. Post-designation, there will be fast-track planning arrangements put in place, and prioritization of urban development zones will be, zones will be prioritized for complementary state investment in infrastructure. So this table here is from the Housing for All, and it sets out how it's intended to work, and I'll just go through how we understand it. This is going to work. So on the left-hand side, for new residential zoning, so for land that has not previously been zoned residential, land value sharing would effectively kick in straight away once it is zoned. In urban development zones, where much of the land would already be zoned already, the land value sharing would apply to any increase in the value of loan or the value of the land that would arise from the urban development zone designation. So it's the difference between prior to designation and after designation. And then for other zoned residential land, the arrangements that are currently in place in relation to Section 48 and 49 development levies, they'll stay in place. But after a period of time, which will be at least 6 years, there'll be complementary measures to basically move on from those measures, or move on from those arrangements into new arrangements that align more closely with land value sharing. In terms of large-scale residential developments, there's been a bill published just this week, and I know Rachel will talk a bit more about that. But again, what it endeavours to do is to replace the strategic housing development legislation, and it will retain some aspects of it, certainly in terms of its applicability. It'll have similarities to it, but we'll see a return of applications being made to the Development Local Planning Authority, and being appealed then to Morpeth Audit. There's an intention to have tighter timeframes and to limit the scope for further information requests, again to try and keep a better certainty about time in relation to planning. There's, in terms of other planning reforms, there's again an objective of having an overall review of the planning code by the Attorney General, carried out by the end of next year. And there's also a complementary objective there in terms of judicial review process that will basically be reformed, and there'll be an establishment of a new division of the High Court that'll deal with planning and environmental matters. Again, before I leave land, there's a new residential zoned land tax. This is to replace the current system of the vacant site levy, which has been problematic and has maybe achieved what it was intended to achieve. It's set out in the Finance Bill 2021, and it applies more broadly than the previous vacant site levy to residential land. There will be a phasing in of that. It'll take 2 years to phase in, and in the meantime, the vacant site levy will continue to apply until it does. So for the part of the reason it needs time to phase in is there's a substantial land mapping requirement set out in the legislation, where local authorities have to prepare zoning maps, and also there'll be an ability for the public to look at that and to make observations and to effectively say that my piece of land shouldn't be zoned on that map, etc., etc. So there'll be an extensive period of engagement in relation to that, but the liability to pay tax will be based on what's finally included in the final zoned land map, and the tax itself will be collected by the revenue commissioners. Another objective that's included in Pathway 3 is just the increase of housing supply through the LDA. So 2021 was a very important year for the LDA. Their Enabling Act, which gives them all their powers, was passed this year. And they have an important role in terms of developing housing in Ireland over the next decade and beyond. So further state lands are being made available for potential development, and there's a list of that land in Housing for All. I haven't reproduced it here, but that with that land, it's intended that up to 15,000 dwellings could be delivered off that land, including key central urban areas. Now, again, some of the land has existing uses, so there'll be time taken to transfer uses away from the existing sites, etc., involved in that as well. There's a specific activation measure that's set out there in Pathway 3 as well, which we are directly involved in. The Housing Agency is directly involved in the Croí Cónaithe initiative, and there's two flavors of Croí Cónaithe. There's the Cities Fund, which we will be directly involved in, and there's the Towns Fund, which local authorities will be involved in. And I'll concentrate on the cities one. So basically, both of them are intended to facilitate compact residential growth, with the cities one being focused on apartments. So it will be the larger fund, over 350 million, and there's 50 million set aside for both funds in budget 2022. The objective is to address viability challenges in urban areas that are affecting particularly the chances for people to buy apartments. So it'll be focused on apartments with at least 4 floors or more, and there'll also be a density requirement. And there's a requirement for the apartments to be sold to individual purchasers. This is just a graphic there from the document, which is a CSO graphic actually. But what it's intended to show is that the graphic showing the apartment blocks there, there has been significant increase in the planning applications and planning approvals that have been given in relation to apartments. So they've gone from 9,000 to 26,000 there over the 3 years that are included, whereas conventional housing has been relatively static in the same period of time. So a lot of apartments are in the system, but not all of them are being developed. So it'll only be open to apartments in blocks of 4 stories more. There will also be a minimum density threshold. There'll be a cap on funding, so it won't be an unlimited subsidy, and visibility will be required in relation to development costs. So there will be an open book type approach in relation to costs. And I suppose the key objective is that apartments must be made available for sale to individual purchasers. There's other, again, measures in Pathway 4 in relation to increasing labour and sector capacity. So I think David's going to talk more about this in his section, but there's a need to have a quite a significant increase in the labour force that's available to residential construction, from 40,000 to at least 67,000, and it might go beyond that at peak. There is measures that are in place. There's an action plan for apprenticeships, which will definitely or should definitely assist that. And also there's plans there for departments to get involved in integrated education training for I suppose for school leavers, etc., to improve their skills that would meet the needs of the industry. And also the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment will also look at the employment permit system to effectively make it easier as required to bring in workers from overseas. In terms of funding, it's been, I suppose, well advertised that the amount of funding that's involved in Housing for All is averaging over 4 billion. That's made up of state capital of 12 billion, LDA investment of 3.5, and HFA additional lending for HFA of 5 billion, and that's over a 5-year period. So if you add those together and divide by 5, you get just over 4 billion per year. Now, sorry, I moved on there accidentally. In addition, there'll be additional investment in infrastructure to support residential development through the Urban Regeneration Development Fund and Irish Water. And that's not included in those figures. And I've just put there that Housing Finance Ireland, which is a lender to the development sector, currently has over 700 million in lending capacity still available, and they can call on up to another 750. Then the last slide I have is just in relation to the gap between what the state is able to provide and what is required for 33,000 homes to be delivered every year. So Housing for All estimates that cost to be in excess of 12 billion. So there's a very big role for non-state funding, and it's a critical role for non-state funding to be involved in building all the homes. So there's various different sources for that funding, and the plan sets out the Department of Finance will carry out a biannual assessment of the availability of non-state funding to support the overall delivery targets. So that's me. That's the end of my session. I'll take questions later on.
Thank you very much, Jim, and just right on time. So thank you. Just a reminder to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A part of the at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those after the 3 presentations. So thanks, Jim, for a very comprehensive overview of Pathway 3, which, as you can see, is pretty complicated and comprehensive. I'm going to move on now to our second speaker, Rachel Kenny, who's Director of Planning at An Bord Pleanála. She joined the board in 2015, having previously worked as a senior planner in Fingal and Meath. Rachel has a BE in Civil Engineering and a Master's in Regional and Urban Planning from UCD, and over 25 years experience in the public sector, having initially worked in the private sector. Rachel has a long-time interest in urban development and housing, particularly in the drafting of the SHD legislation and overseeing its implementation in the board. So Rachel, I'm going to call on you now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, David. I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, so for that sharing. Obviously, just to say initially, thank you to the Housing Agency for allowing me to address you all and to participate in this very important series of conversations and discussions. I think over the last few days, collaboration, discussion, listening to people, talking to people, it's all very, very important, and it is how we will find a solution to the current housing crisis. So, okay. So in terms of delivery of housing, as has been outlined, a coordination involving response is required. So the challenges we face in the delivery of housing are multifaceted, and therefore the solutions must be coordinated and cross-sectoral and multi-organisational, and will take time and commitment. So we started with this back in 2015, 2016, the Action Plan for Housing and Homelessness in terms of rebuilding Ireland. And now we have the iteration in terms of Housing for All, and there will be further iterations, all leading to teamwork and consolidation of all of our efforts together. In terms of planning, we now have, since that start of it all, a national planning policy and really kind of consolidated framework to allow us to shape new places for future populations. So this is the theory, we need to make it a reality. In terms of local planning, it has a critical role. And I would say that planners want to be part of the solution. We don't all have the same idea as to what that solution may be, but we do all have that same desire to see the end of the housing crisis and the end of homelessness. So, you know, nobody is trying to make the situation worse, and we do have to remember that as we move forward. So in terms of planning, we have forward planning and development management. So obviously forward planning is about ensuring the adequacy of lands that are zoned for housing in the right location. But I would suggest that it needs to provide certainty and context for sure, but also needs to be flexible and realistic and responsive to evolving policy changes at national level and also evolving demographic needs. I would say that overly restrictive and overly ambitious plans don't deliver. For example, we've had SDZs now for nearly 20 years, but while they brought certainty, they failed to deliver the number of residential units envisaged. That is partly because of the constraints attached to them and the funding associated. So I do hope that the urban development zones are an improved iteration of that. In terms of development management, that needs to deliver permissions which obviously influence the number of units available to the industry to construct, but also facilitates evolving housing typologies, densities, heights, and communities, and what our new communities will look like. It permits enabling infrastructure, which is critical and which has been lacking to a certain extent and has been problematic for communities that are trying to absorb new housing. So development management should also aspire to be transparent, timely, and robust, and that is a critical component, I believe, of development management. And I'll focus on that because that's where the board's primary functions lie. Before I start looking forward, I just want to take a look back and remind people of where we kind of came from. Basically, in 2016, there were delays in the planning process, taking almost 2 years to get through pre-planning, formal 247, section 34 with the planning authorities, and then on appeal to the board. So 2 years was considered far too long. Then 95% of large-scale housing was appealed to the board. So that 2 years was almost inevitable. And at the end of that time, only 50% of the applications were granted. So the only thing certain about planning was that it took a long time, and that after all the time and investment in the process, the chance of permission was the equivalent of the toss of a coin. This was not seen as appropriate and still isn't seen as appropriate. So the solution at that time was the Action Plan for Housing and Homelessness, which introduced SHD legislation, the fast track planning system. As we've mentioned already, that related to 100 or more bed space, 100 or more houses, or 200 bed spaces for student accommodation, for shared living component now removed. It was always on zoned land for residential use or a mix of residential use. It was intended initially to be up to December 2019 and extended up to the end of this year. So it'll come to its natural end at the end of this year. So SHD successes, and I believe there were many. So what it did do was it delivered on timeliness of decision-making and certainty around that decision-making. And there has been an increase in permissions in terms available to the industry, albeit we've yet to see that full realisation of them, and that is down to viability, which both Jim and I presume David will talk about in a little bit. So over 530 pre-application applications were received and over 400 applications. So you can see the number of residential units in the system that the board have been dealing with over the last 4.5 to 5 years. Permissions comprise 75% granted within that 16-week timeline, unless there's an oral hearing, 60,000 residential units with a greater number of apartments than housing. Obviously at the start, more housing, but it has moved towards apartments, which does reflect the changing demographics and needs. 13,000, over 13,000 bed spaces, so they are separate to the residential units, separate to apartments. Very few co-living, only 200 co-living bed spaces, so it hasn't been that large number that perhaps had been alluded to in the media. Just to say, in terms of JOs, obviously it has been well publicised that there's been a significant number of JOs. However, it has only lost or reduced the number of residential units available by about 6,000. This is less than 10% of the overall number permitted, And also it is less than the numbers constructed and delivered through the SDZs, notwithstanding they've been in existence for almost 20 years now. I won't go through these detailed slides in terms of SHD and what it comes about in terms of pre-apps and applications, but I'll move forward into the kind of where we're going and what we've delivered. So then I suppose housing, I would say, rather than SHD alone, has become unpopular. But yet I'd also say it's always been unpopular. SHD at the moment is the easy scapegoat, and unfortunately I don't believe LOD will be any different. So under SHD, there's no appeals. There is a perceived lack of public consultation, notwithstanding that public consultation is the same as for Section 34. And perhaps our engagement with the planning authorities most certainly has been much more expensive under SHD when compared to Section 34 on appeal. I agree that it's been less than SID, but again, that was probably an area that could have been improved. The perception of greater levels of material contravention, and I'd say it's perception rather than necessarily reality. But again, we can talk about that later. Work NOLA has enabled a changing planning context, implementing Section 28 guidelines, and that's probably been the greatest bone of contention. But I would say that prior to SHD, and what stimulated SHD was 95% of large-scale residential developments were appealed to the board. And just so that you know, outside of SHD, 70% of the board's work still relates to those strategic housing residential schemes. So residential remains very much a bone of contention in existing communities. Again, lack of public consultation. There's no public consultation in terms of Section 34 or in terms of LOD. I would note that pre-SHD, low density, low height, and schemes reflective of adjacent housing were also opposed by neighbouring residential areas. 75% appealed to the board with a 50% refusal rate. So I think the real question is who speaks for future residents and those that need homes? Opposition to residential development has not materially changed over the last 15 or 20 years, but perhaps our perception of the scale of opposition has changed, and that's because there are new avenues for that opposition. So can we and should we better engage with the public and make the planning and delivery of housing less adversarial? It's particularly adversarial in Ireland, and we don't have that same planning context or legal context across the rest of Europe or in our neighbours in the UK. So we need to take a look at that, and maybe the planning reform and the judicial review reform will assist. I think that the JOs were very much enabled by that Heather Hill judgment in respect of Section 50B, which allowed for, I suppose, objectors and people taking forward JOs to no longer be liable for significant legal fees. That has been overturned by the Court of Appeal. So we should hopefully see a reduction in the number of JOs coming forward in any event. So where are we now? The next steps, housing for all. So housing for all in terms of where the board's primary focus will be in and around that increase for new housing supply in terms of the delivery of permissions that can be enacted. We are also a little bit involved in the vacant site taxes or vacant site levies and so on, although it starts with the planning authority. So I'll predominantly focus on the positive and increasing housing supply by way of increasing permissions. In particular, I look at the new planning process, the large-scale residential developments, and that bill that is going forward at the moment, although it is only one of a number of measures intended to improve housing supply from a planning perspective. So delivering permissions for housing and finding the right planning solution to deliver housing. This is obviously very, very key to what we are talking about. And I suppose I'll spend a little bit of time focusing on this. So strategic housing development delivered on timeliness and certainty in terms of decision making. And that was a first since probably the beginning of the planning process. And I think it has not, the difficulties in doing that is not to be underestimated, but it was not popular. And I think probably not because of that reason, but because it coincided with a number of other elements in the planning system. And in particular, it coincided with the implementation of evolving government and national policy, which sought increased height, density, and changing housing typologies. And this is probably the more contentious element for a lot of existing residential communities. Investment funds began to replace private landlords and traditional local banking or national banking financing. And that again, also not a I suppose an element that SHD introduced, it just coincided with it. There was no appeal mechanism, and I suppose bearing in mind that 95% of applications were appealed, that was a big removal from the system. There has been a greater level of legal scrutiny and a move of some judges perhaps to enter into what were traditionally considered to be the primary merits of a case. This has perhaps improved the transparency and the scale of assessment involved. But I think whether it's SHD or LOD, this is going to remain, and that level of intense scrutiny into the planning reports will remain. So how does Housing for All tackle some of these issues? So the large-scale residential development bill, we introduced appeals. It has increased timelines significantly. So there's no longer fast-track housing applications. I don't share Jim's I suppose optimism regarding the streamlining of the system. I think that it will probably take 28 to 52 weeks to get through the actual formal planning application process, in addition to the pre-application process prior to this. It does allow further information requests, and the timelines will be uncertain going forward. Obviously, we have regulation of commercial institutional investment in housing. So there's a greater push now to see more units available for sale. And I think that is actually going to assist if we can balance it correctly and we don't demonize any one sector that are assisting in the provision of housing and increasing housing supply. We have the urban development zones, which appear to be the next iteration of SVZ. And I would say the SVZs, like most things, needed to evolve and they haven't delivered as intended. So I do hope that the urban development zones introduce that flexibility in terms of deliverability of housing and viability, and also are appropriately funded. And again, JR and planning reform and review. So just to say at the outset, moving from SHD to LOD, the board is very much supportive of the next stages. SHD was only intended to be a temporary solution, and we do need to move back to a more permanent solution, and that is a version of LOD. I hope that it is something other than the bill that is going forward, because I think that's unrealistic and unworkable from the board's perspective. But the board are very much want to play a positive role and want to assist in the delivery of housing and be efficient and effective in terms of the output of decisions. So
2 minutes, please, Rachel. Thanks very much.
So what I see is the key obstacles in terms of the successful implementation of LOD, which I think need to be addressed, are the absence, well, I suppose to date, the absence of meaningful consultation and lack of understanding how the legislation will work in practice. For the board in particular, the timelines are unrealistic and the procedures are not appropriate to the board's functioning. Availability of staff and resources and expertise. We have been very much under-resourced over the last year or so, and it's not where the board want to be, and it will be to the detriment of the implementation of the legislation. We need to resolve conflicts between local and national policy. And as I said, the JO reform would be helpful, although I do believe the Court of Appeal judgment has already assisted or will assist in this anyway. So my last slide, making the aspirations a reality and trying to get consensus and support and I suppose engagement. So personally, what I think is needed and what should be prioritised, reasonable and realistic staff and resources available to the Planning Authority and the board. That hasn't happened yet. Simplification of the planning system and judicial review reform. So working with practitioners to deliver legislation that works in practice. Again, I would love to see that, and I'd love to be able to engage with the department for that LOD legislation to work in practice. Commitment to the delivery of housing across all typologies, to recognise the value and importance of change, responding to changing demographics and environmental constraints. Education and promotion of planning systems, sustainable housing, higher densities, heights and new typologies. So those who invest in build housing, those who rent housing in apartments, and those who permit that housing in apartments, we're not the enemy. They're not the enemy. And I think we need to do a PR drive on that. Financial supports including tax incentives and not just disincentives or penalties to improve the viability and of apartments and higher density schemes. So it's great, as Jim outlined, that Housing for All is hoping to tackle this. Again, funding infrastructure that supports future housing. I think this is really, really key and very, very important. So schools, telecommunication mass, roads, rail, water, waste, and so on. The lack of existing infrastructure within existing communities is a really huge bone of contention, and it is probably why most communities object and appeal decisions regarding housing, because they are already lacking the necessary infrastructure to support their need, and more housing on top of that only worsens that situation. So that will be key. So that is the end of my whistle-stop tour through my side of planning and its role in increasing housing supply. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was a great overview of the planning side of things. And of course, you can't have new housing supply without planning, without land. And we are building for the next 100 years or so. So we need to make sure that what we're planning and what we're doing is right. So thank you for your input there. Our third speaker is David Duffy, who's the Director of Property Industry Ireland, which is representative business with an interest in the property and the construction industry, including banks, financial institutions, asset and property managers, contractors, developers and builders, and property professional service providers, such as architects, surveyors, engineers, and planners. Before joining PII, David was Senior Research Officer at the Economic and Social Research Institute, working in the Economic Analysis Division, and was an editor of the ESRI's Quarterly Economic Commentary for from 2011. His main interest of research was in the housing market. Dr. Duffy previously held positions with the Chamber of Commerce of Ireland and Fitzpatrick Associates, the Dublin-based economic consultants. So David is going to talk about delivering housing for all. So over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. So yes, my focus is on delivering housing for all and some of the issues and constraints, but also how we might look at overcoming them. I think the backdrop has been well spoken about in the last two presentations. I think the target within the plan is for 33,000 units on average. Estimates vary. We've seen estimates of 36, 37,000, some higher, but they're of that order. But in terms of resources for the sector, I think the other element is just the whole climate action plan and retrofit, and there are very ambitious targets there, which have to be met. I think, and these have been talked about by the other presenters, so I won't dwell on them. But I mean, I think it's really good that we have a long-term plan. I think it's good that we have targets and that those targets are set out by different tenures. But there are a lot of demands. I mean, the plan itself estimates that there's a need for close to 30,000 additional workers. But not only are there the housing for all targets in terms of delivery of units, there's also the commitment to retrofit homes, there's the NDP, there's pent-up demand, demand for housing that hasn't been met over the past number of years. So there's a lot of demand out there, and I think that additional 27,500 workers could indeed be a minimum, but also there are a lot of different segments competing for the same pool of workers. So I think that's a key issue. I put this slide up. This is data from the CSO on the numbers employed. The blue line shows the numbers employed in the overall economy, and the orange line is those employed in construction. The reason I put it up, I suppose, is it shows the decline in construction employment was much more severe than that in the overall economy. And while over time we saw and this pre-COVID, we saw the employment in the overall economy recover and move back to levels above where it had been prior to the crash, we can see from the orange line that really we didn't get the same recovery in construction employment. And so to some extent, while those of us within the sector would have been well aware of the skill shortages or the demand for labor and that, the recovery in the overall economy probably masked that. So it's an issue for the sector for quite some time. I got some data from the CSO on employment by age, and what we really see here is that I suppose a couple of things from this. I suppose the younger age groups, the blue and the orange, you can see those levels fall and become much less frequent as we move up to the present day. Now, that doesn't mean that they've all left the construction workforce. It means that just the numbers became so low that the CSO felt they weren't kind of statistically reliable and so didn't publish them. But also we can see as we move forward, as we move forward in time and the workforce ages, you can see the compression of the gray and the yellow bars, which are the 25 up to 44-year-olds, and the numbers employed become much lower in those in the kind of the younger age groups of the construction workforce, which I think is definitely an issue. And going back to Rachel's point on the apprenticeships, I mean the fact that the numbers in the blue and orange, which are those aged up to 24 years, are so low is definitely an issue, and we need to look at why the younger age groups aren't being attracted in. Is it structures? Is it the volatility that we have seen in construction output and the cycles that sector goes through? So are there things there around certainty of demand, and the fact that this is a 10-year plan probably goes some way to addressing that there's certainty about the targets and what the sector has to deliver, and knowing that you have a career with that certain level of demand should hopefully at least help the attractiveness of the sector to the younger age groups. In this slide, I just do it by percentage, and the key point that I want to make here is if you look at the green and the blue up at the top, they're the older age groups, and I suppose if we take it over the course of this of the plan, what we will see is that around 20% of the existing construction sector workforce will either retire or come close to retiring. So I suppose going back to my point, that 28,500 people, workers needed for the sector, you know, there's also the replacement of the existing workers as they age and leave the workforce. So that target may well be a minimum. I'd have to say though, despite the challenges, we are seeing significant increases in construction sector activity. These take a number of the indicators for the construction sector, and it's a 12-month rolling sum, but you can see a really significant increase, and Rachel touched on this, in the amount of units getting planning permission, the amount of commencements, and the number of units being completed. The yellow line being the number of units being completed. Now, in recent years, I suppose we've seen with COVID, we've seen the momentum to some extent come out of that increase, and that we're still around the 20,000 units. But given where we were at, there's been a really significant increase in housing sector output, and it's really looking at how we can further increase that 20,000 up towards the 37,000 or whatever units that are forecast to be needed each year, and looking at how we can deliver those across the different tenures. Rachel touched on this, but I think one of the things is that we really need to recognize that this is something that we need to work together on, and to stop demonizing particular segments of the the sector. I mean, there are roles for all the different stakeholders within the sector, as we've seen over time, and I think that some of the labels are unhelpful and demonizing particular segments. This is something that there is no silver bullet to, and there is no one single stakeholder who's going to be able to solve the issues in the housing system. So I think it requires us all to come together and engage, and that's both public sector and private sector working together to understand each other's, I suppose, business model, way of operating, whatever. Recognize that there are a common pool of skills out there that both the public and the private sector are looking for resources from. And I think the private sector has a role to play in this. I think it's really important that we work with the public sector so that particularly, and we're talking here today about housing, but particularly how the development process operates. What are the things that drive the decision makers, the decision making of home builders? And because this is about delivering housing or dwellings, houses and apartments into the market. And through that forum or engagement, forum or otherwise, but I think the engagement is really important. Looking at the different impact of measures, how will they impact on supply? And I think looking at the measures within Housing for All, or indeed any policies related to the system, the housing system, as to how they will impact on supply, I think is a really important lens to avoid unintended consequences, to avoid, and I think this loops back into understanding the development process, so that we avoid measures which may solve one issue but cause issues further on down the line. And in that regard, I've been reading and have been kind of taken by the work that's being done by an Italian-American economist called Mariana Mazzucato, who has written a book called The Mission Economy, which is about the collaboration that took place around the Apollo mission in the 1960s. She sets out a number of things that are needed to address. In her book, she focuses on the climate crisis, but I think it can also be equally applied to the kind of issue we're facing here in Ireland on the housing system. I mean, and in many ways, the Housing for All it starts this process and goes a long way towards it in terms of it does provide a vision. I think when he opened the conference on Monday, the minister set out a strong sense of purpose. But that we also have to recognize that both the public and the private sector are going to have to take risks around this and innovate and be flexible. And I think just the quote there from it, some solutions worked in the instance of the Apollo mission, many failed. But I think when we're looking at this, there has to be risk taking by both the public and the private sector, and budget for it, and recognize that there is going to be a cost and risk. But again, it's around collaborating with a sense, collaborating around a vision that we address the issues and reach a point where I suppose, look, where we're providing housing for all. And in that regard, I mean, look at innovation and maybe alternative approaches. And in that regard, offsite construction is possibly something that can help address the system. It allows us to deliver housing in a faster manner. It helps against the backdrop of the environmental targets as well, which are going to be increasingly important for the sector. but also it allows for skills diversity in that in producing some of the offsite, you're going to be using manufacturing skills rather than necessarily using the pure construction skills that are in such demand at the moment. So again, it's operating with the same goal in mind of delivering more housing, but it's trying to be innovative and look at an alternative approach. And I suppose broaden out the range of skills that we are looking for, rather than focusing purely on the same set of skills all the time. So in terms of where we're at, I suppose a few key messages that we would take, or that we would like to deliver, is I think the provision of certainty is really important, I suppose, from a skills and an apprenticeship and a retention of labor within the sector. I think that's really important. But it also allows a buildup of capacity, in that you're not expanding and contracting to as cycles go up and down. You've got a stable pipeline across, and in the construction side, this would be across both housing but also infrastructure investment, whatever. But this certainty and stable pipeline allows investment in the sector, and that investment can take place in labor and resources to that. So I think that's really important. I think, you know, it's also important to look at what are the delays in the delivery of housing, because if you're spending longer than is optimal on particular schemes or whatever, they're absorbing your capacity and not allowing you to move on to the next project. But I think it's also important that we recognize that there's a need to look at public sector capacity, and this could be within the planning system, and how the replacement for the SHD, the large scale residential developments, what demands will that put on the local planning authorities, and are they resourced to deliver those? So again, we're working together to avoid delays and ensure that we do get delivery of homes into the market. And I think it's also important to look at what are the other delays. I think Rachel touched on things like judicial reviews and that there are delays at the moment. At the moment, with regard to availability of materials, there's this kind of world supply chain issue. But what are the other delays that are impacting on delivery? And then I think, going back to some of my earlier points, I think collaboration is key. As I say, I don't think that there's one solution or one stakeholder who's going to solve this. I think it's the public and private sector coming together, understanding each other, and setting out a common goal of addressing the issues that are impacting on the housing system and working together to overcome them. And I think it's by that collaboration will bring us a long way to delivering the targets that exist within Housing for All. So thank you very much, and I'll finish on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that input and for keeping to time there. We've had a good few questions in so far. So I'm just going to start maybe with Jim, if that's okay, Jim.
Yep.
There's a couple of questions about Croí Connogha, which I know is one of your pet subjects. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about, can you avail of Croí Connogha with other funding like URDF? And also, how are we going to ensure that the benefit is passed on to the final purchaser? And how can we, I suppose, ensure we're getting value for money out of the scheme? Have you any thoughts on that?
In terms of using or combining Croí Connogha with other funding or other delivery methods, that is being looked at. I suppose the first thing, or the current thing that's being considered is combining it with Project Tussock. So the LDA are due to go out to the market, the development market, again for unactivated planning permissions to look for joint venture opportunities to deliver affordable housing. So there's certainly consideration given to that. In fact, it might be combined with it. There's other interventions in terms of cost rental equity loan system, which again might lend itself to having Croí Cónaithe delivered in parallel with that. In terms of the URDF, we haven't looked closely at that with the department so far in terms of combining with that. I kind of slightly forgot the second one. Sorry if you remind me.
Oh, just making sure that we're getting value for money and that the benefit is being passed on to the final.
Yeah, in Housing for All, there's mention of an open book approach, and like that will be very important in terms of being able to achieve that. There will be an element of competition involved to this as well in terms of going out to the development sector to see what comes back and comparing the proposals in terms of what is the most beneficial. So between the open book approach and the competitive aspect that we intend to bring into it, we'd hope that we will be able to achieve the correct type of benefit for the end purchaser.
Okay. Here's one for the whole panel. What does the panel think are the solutions to the alienation of the citizen from the planning system, and how might we restore the trust that has been lost? Maybe David or Rachel, would you like to start? And how can we?
I think that's a particularly loaded question. I don't know what alienation that obviously the person asking the question is referring to. So impossible to answer it.
David, you sort of addressed it a little bit, did you, in your presentation?
Not sure. I mean, again, I'm not sure how that alienation is manifesting itself. So difficult to put forward solutions when I'm not sure what the problem is.
Yeah, I'm kind of reading it that people feel that they're not able to participate in the planning system as much as they'd like to, and maybe therefore they object to everything on the basis that that's the only way to get involved.
Yeah, there might be an element of that. Like again, it's a tricky question to answer, but I think that there's an inherent fear of change that most people have. So when there's a plan to change something in their area, that there's a kind of a natural sort of resistance to it. Whether there's a better transparency or better engagement by the proposer involved, but just again, just a personal example of it with my own sister. She was very against a development beside her, but it's completed now and it's nothing like as bad as she thought it was going to be. So I think a lot of time that the fear of change can be maybe the issue more so than the actual change when it's delivered in due course.
And actually, the Irish planning system is a huge level of public engagement and public consultation, and so many bites of the cherry compared to every other European country and planning system. So I'm not sure in terms of alienation. And I think that obviously people may feel alienated when they don't get what they want. And obviously we can't please all of the people all of the time. The delivery of housing requires compromise and balance, and that is what planning is about. And somebody is always going to be not happy with the decision, whether that is the person who objected or the person who proposed it. But there's always going to be somebody unhappy with whatever decision, and whether that decision is made by the planning authority or by the board, somebody is always unhappy with the decision. So I think, acceptance of that fact probably is also required. But again, I think there is a huge education required around what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. And we have to move towards compact growth. That is inevitable if we're going to be sustainable and so on. But I do think that the funding and the infrastructure, the social and physical infrastructure necessary to allow communities absorb additional housing is critical, because it will, I suppose, reduce the pain of that additional housing.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. David, there's one here that might be addressed to you. How can SMEs with an emphasis on small get involved from the services consultants, that architects, engineers, etc., point of view to help deliver the number of dwellings required? A large number of small companies have massive talent, know-how, and enthusiasm to get involved. So how can we get SMEs involved in housing delivery?
Well, I actually think SMEs do play a role. I mean, I think a lot of SMEs would be involved in delivering projects that maybe don't come up to, that are lower than the 100 units. I mean, I suppose there's a lot of focus on large scale developments because they'll deliver a large quantum, but I think there's also a lot of delivery going on with smaller schemes that are also delivering important numbers of units into the system. So I suppose it's building up links between that companies build up links between themselves, between like maybe a small architect linking with a small or medium sized building company. But I do think that is happening. As I say, there's a lot of focus on the larger schemes, but I do think it is happening at the smaller scale as well.
Okay, thanks, David. Anybody else like to comment on that?
Just from the public procurement point of view, I think there can be maybe some barriers there for some smaller or newer consultancy practices getting involved, but I think there is effort made to try and facilitate them. Certainly there was some directives there issued by Department of Public Expenditure Reform there a number of years ago to try and facilitate newer companies getting engaged with the public procurement in terms of consultation, etc. But I suppose I'd acknowledge it can be challenging, particularly when frameworks are used, because if you're not in the framework, you can be kind of excluded for a period of time in terms of getting an opportunity. So,
okay. Jim, while we have you here, there's two questions about the land value tax. Why is it taking so long, and can we be confident that all the local authorities will be able to do it, and will there be any enforcement as well in terms of enforcing the land value tax? Do you have any details on that, or?
I'll do my best based on what I've read in the draft legislation in the bill. But in terms of the mapping exercise, as I understand it, there is obviously land zoning there at the moment, but there's specific requirements set out in the tax legislation for the application of a tax to a piece of zoned land. So if, for instance, the zoned land is zoned residential, but it isn't connected to services or roads or any other facilities that would make it developable, well, then that should not be included in the map. If the zoned land has a large road reservation included in it, so effectively, say, half the site might be set aside for roads, which can't be developed on, again, the map has to take account of that. So it's not, I think, a simple process. There's a number of categories that are criteria that has to be satisfied to be included in the map for planning. In terms of resourcing and all that, I think it's mentioned there by Rachel in her presentation about planning authorities. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's a big task. I think it's to be done by the 1st of November next year. So I can't speak on behalf of all local authorities, but I dare say it might be challenging for them to do their initial mapping by that timescale. In terms of the certainty of getting the tax collected, I think the revenue commissioners always are pretty reliable in getting tax. So I think once it's left to them, I think it's one of the things that maybe the vacant site levy struggle with, because local authorities aren't set up to collect tax, but the revenue commissioners definitely are.
Okay, yes, and they're very good at that. Now, there was one here that I was looking at around environmental Yeah, so considering the very worrying climate situation and our need to increase housing output, what are the tangible steps providers can take to balance providing increased housing output in an environmentally friendly way while meeting value for money appraisals without incurring delays in development or delivery? So how can we, I suppose, increase housing output while remaining environmentally friendly? I don't know if anybody would like to give a view on that, considering all the activity in Glasgow at the moment.
I'll chance my arm. I think, you know, a lot of the higher density apartment developments are generally the greener type of housing. Ultimately, they might maybe look like it because they're tall buildings, etc. But in terms of the kind of the overall footprint per occupant, etc., in terms of greenhouse gas emission and the kind of lifestyle issues in terms of proximity to services, etc., they tend to do a lot better than dispersed housing. So it is the more controversial type of housing to get planning permission for, but it probably is the most green type, particularly when it's built near existing transport infrastructure, etc.
And just to come in on that, David, I mean, I think what I mentioned, the offsite construction approach, which helps. I mean, things are then being done in an in a factory environment. There's less waste. There's less toing and froing from sites, so they all have an impact. But I suppose in terms of meeting the environmental targets, this goes back to one of the things I was talking about in terms of it's collaboration across the system. Because in order to make it as effective as possible, you want to be delivering housing where there is a public transport network, which means that people aren't using their cars as much. So again, it's working across the system to deliver that.
And there's a related question here, or well, not a related question, but maybe around the cost of building impacting on viability. Any solutions in relation to reducing the cost? You mentioned offsite. Is that cheaper, or is it just quicker or more environmentally friendly?
At the moment, the costs are in and around. My understanding is that the costs are in and around the same, but it is, you do face lower funding costs because you're delivering quicker, and it is more environmentally friendly. I think once you get to a point where there is sufficient scale, and this is one of the challenges, particularly within the context of the Irish market, which is smaller than other European markets, where you get to scale, then you start where the number of units is higher, you then start delivering economies of scale, which help bring down the cost. And also, if you have certainty and a stable pipeline, and people can make the investment, I think that also helps. You know, in my work on a daily basis, the issue of viability is one of the key things in the cost of construction, and looking at the different components that feed into the cost of construction is something that interaction between a viability, delivery, affordability, that's one of the key issues that we look at and have to try and find solutions for.
I'd also say, just from a planning perspective, I think the ability of plans, you know, to accommodate evolving construction methodologies and typologies and viability and changing kind of factors such as, you know, the reduction of car parking requirements to allow for less car parking requirements, so less car ownership, more car sharing, electric charging, and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter what it is, but all of the plans need to be more flexible to allow us to evolve and change. And at the moment, the historic plans don't. They are very rigid in their development standards that they apply, that don't reflect the changes required to address climate change and so on. And I think that every kind of 5-10 years that go by, those standards need to change to be more adaptive to our new technologies and our new understanding of what we need to do to address issues such as climate change, viability, costs, and so on. And that is a thing that some of the plans don't actually accommodate.
Okay. Here's a question just around social housing delivery. There's been excellent collaboration in recent years between public and private on delivery, as there has been little appetite for risk with private developers. However, as demand consistently outstrips supply, private developers in pursuit of greater profit will not be interested in public social delivery in their estates, other than the minimum Part 5. How do we protect against that, as minimum Part 5 will not be enough to meet social housing targets over the coming years? So I suppose, David, if I could ask you, are private developers still interested in social housing delivery? And then Jim, maybe if you could address where is social housing going to come from in the next 5 or 10 years?
Okay, so I'll go first. I mean, absolutely, home builders are still interested in delivery of social housing, and going forward, there's going to be a social and affordable housing element. I mean, more. So there is a lot of the delivery has come from the private sector, either directly or working in conjunction with the local authorities or the AHBs. So no, there is that commitment there. I mean, there is an overall drive within the home building segment to be delivering homes that meet affordability requirements into the system. So no, that's there, and that's going forward. And I think that's, I suppose, one of the really useful things about the targets within Housing for All, that they're set out by the different tenures.
Just in terms of my view about the private sector interest in social housing or delivering housing, I suppose, being blunt about it, they're interested in selling on properties and having completed schemes. So there has been a significant interest in that, and there's still I think I don't see that diminishing to any significant degree over the next number of years. Beyond that, there's obviously a need to deliver on local authority land, and there is an objective in Housing for All to ultimately to acquire more local authority land. So depending on which local authority you're talking about, they will, some of them will run out of good development land fairly quickly. And again, because of the requirement to have sustainable communities and to have a balance between tenures, a large site, say DCC, for example, won't be developed just entirely for social. So that kind of constrains them on social housing. The LDA, with its state land initiative and access to state lands, I think there's potential there for fairly significant social housing delivery as well as affordable housing delivery. But I think there will be a requirement for local authorities to get new land. And just going back to Part 5 arrangements, the amended ones that are included in 2021 Act, there is an ability to go beyond half of the requirement there, and turn it to 20%, which will eventually kick in terms of delivery of new schemes. It can go beyond 10 for social. It can increase if there's a particular need, particularly if there's less of a need for affordable.
And would you see local authorities reverting to the delivery of social housing, as was the case in the past? That was a question from Eugene Dunn. Would you see more local authorities be getting back building themselves?
I think that is the objective. Again, it's a question of I suppose building up capacity. There was very little social housing built by local authorities about 5 years ago. It is building up. It's probably building up at a pace that people would like to see quicken, but it is building up. And I suppose the private developers have filled the gap to quite a degree, even with local authorities in terms of turnkeys. But I think there's definitely a significant interest with local authorities and a keenness to build more themselves on land. But as I was saying, some of them will have constraints in relation to the land that they'll have available over the next, certainly beyond the next couple of years. It'll start to become an issue for some of them.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Rachel, there's one here from Barry White who's just asking about what is Bord Pleanála doing to reduce the backlog of appeals in the system? So I don't know if you have anything that you could add to that. I know you were talking about resources, the need for resources in your presentation. Is there anything that can be done to reduce backlogs in planning?
Unfortunately, the board don't have full control over that, and we have to apply through the department to get additional resources. And while we did highlight to the department that we were going to be struggling to meet our various targets in terms of SOPs and try to prioritize housing, unfortunately, they didn't respond during the course of 2021 in effect, or we just recently got some approvals. We haven't actually got any new staff. So for a year, we've been operating at a deficit. So that's caused the backlogs. So I suppose what I'd say is obviously we need to put resources in and get the resources necessary, because if we don't have the planners available, then we can't actually get the reports produced, and that's hugely problematic. And obviously, as I said throughout the presentation, in addition to the resources, we do need workable legislation. And hopefully the department will ultimately engage so that we can have workable legislation. The LOD bill as it stands for the board, there's been no engagement on that, and it's not workable from our perspective. So certainly the board don't like to be in a position where they're not efficient in terms of timelines. To be told your decision is this date and then it's 4 months out and 4 months out and so on and so forth doesn't actually help viability, doesn't help confidence in the market, and is not where the board want to be. We would rather have the resources and the structures in place and the legislation in place that we could actually deliver confidence in the system. So,
okay, thanks very much. There's a question here which picks up, I think, on David's presentation. How do we attract young people into the construction trades? Currently, second level education is heavily geared towards getting kids to third level education rather than the trades. How can we make carpentry, electricians, plumbers, plasterers?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really key issue. I mean, as I think the over the summer, the announcement that the apprenticeships would be on the CAO system as well. I think, look, that's a positive. I mentioned one thing, which was the stability of the pipeline and certainty. I mean, I think it's really I think that's one of the key elements, that if you go into construction, that you feel that you have a career, and that you're not going to be, because people have seen the cycle over the past 20 years. I mean, over the past 20 years, we've had quite a boom bust cycle. So, and we saw the impact of that on the employment numbers in construction. So, I mean, I think stability and certainty are going to be two key elements. Whether there are things with the structure of the apprenticeship schemes or the apprenticeship system itself, I wouldn't be fully aware of those, but I think that's being looked at by the expert group on future skill needs. But whether there are things about all apprenticeships needing to be 4 years long, do they all need to be 4 years long? Could some be less than 4 years? What are the kind of structures around that apprenticeship scheme? What are the kind of things you do when you go in from day one all the way through the scheme? So there are probably things to be done to make it more attractive there, and then at a more macro level, the certainty and the stability, I think, are also important.
Okay, very good. Thank you, David. There's two questions here around housing for people with disabilities, or the housing needs of people with disabilities. One around wheelchair accessibility, and the other one around developers should be mandated through regulations to provide a percentage of accessible single-story accommodation in lieu of turnkey provided service sites, which charities can then build through CAS. I don't know if any of our speakers have any views on how well we are responding to the housing needs of people with a disability.
Sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
No, I was only going to say that obviously there's Part M regulations. So there is a kind of universal access. So all schemes are intended to be designed to accommodate that, and that housing needs. We do look at that in terms of planning. It is covered under separate regulations, but they are provided for within the schemes that we see. Not all housing, like there's certain you can get down to the downstairs, but it should, there's units granted that are entirely accessible for people with disabilities.
Yeah, I suppose one thing, I suppose, in terms of Part M, it certainly allows visitability for people with disabilities into a dwelling, or that was the intention. But depending on the disability, being able to live within a dwelling can still be challenging, notwithstanding the Part M requirements. So, so I think there is a need to increase the proportion of dwellings that do cater both for people with disabilities or the aging population. I've little doubt that I don't have a disability at the moment, but if I live long enough, I probably will. So I think aging populations will need assistance in their dwellings. And again, we produced a report a couple of years ago about the benefits of people aging in place or being able to age at home compared to being able to having to move into the likes of nursing homes, etc. So I think there is more work to be done in terms of building it into our housing system. So don't have a magic wand solution on it, but I think there definitely is there. Now, one other thing that I'd say, because I live in an apartment myself, and there is a number of older people who live in the scheme, and I think there is a benefit. Some of them have downsized. They've moved out of houses in there because of the availability of lift. So I think there is benefits to having apartments as part of the housing stock, and also in terms of sizing for older singles people as well. But it's not just a question of having a lift. The internal arrangements and say the washing facilities, etc., and even the cooking facilities, etc., has to be looked at.
Okay. I'm skipping around here a little bit. There's a question here from Roderick O'Mahony about providing appropriate infrastructure before developing housing sites, and if we concentrate on building without undertaking the necessary steps, then we're storing up problems for the future. In terms of infrastructural development of sites, are we doing enough, do you think, or is there more that we can be doing?
Definitely more that we can be doing, for sure. And I kind of had said that at the very outset. I think the number of objectives to development, residential development, is on the basis of the lack of existing infrastructure, whether that is, the road network, the public transport network, the capacity within the public transport system to absorb further kind of users of that system, and so on. So even school places, creche places, medical services, and so on, all of that tends to be lacking. It tends to be form a huge part of the objections submitted. So I think that we do need to do more to respond to those deficits within existing communities, especially if we want to increase capacity within, or increase housing output within those kind of compact areas where we feel the service exists. And it is about balance, because those needs come in peaks and troughs as well in terms of education and healthcare services. But I think we could be more responsive and adaptable to addressing that, as well as just the large scale infrastructure, because obviously we need a huge large scale infrastructure projects coming through the system as well. But they will take years to deliver. But the small stuff will be really, really important as well.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Would any of the other speakers like to?
No, I mean, I think Rachel has kind of covered all the points on that. That it's broader than just the roads and services. It's about the kind of facilities within the community. There are in terms of the delivery of housing, there are issues around the services and the utilities that need to be addressed. But I think also when we're looking at how developments link into the community going forward, the environmental aspect, now that's going to be a kind of an umbrella over it in terms of provision of what kind of infrastructure is provided in terms of transport or public transport and that. So yeah, I think I think it's something that we'll definitely have to look at with that kind of environmental lens going forward as well.
Okay, I'm going to finish up in 2 minutes, but before I do, I have a quick question for Jim, and then I'm going to go around the panel and ask you if you wanted to just say a final remark in terms of what you see as the priority in the delivery of housing under Housing for All. But Jim, I noticed that our very first question was from Olga, and she asked us to confirm when the local authority affordable housing scheme will be fully operational. Are you able to provide any update on that first?
I am. The first schemes that will deliver affordable purchase housing are being built at the moment. One down in Boherboy in Cork, another one in Doneamer in Fingal. The Boherboy scheme is I think about just over 100 units, and the one in Doneamer is about 40. So I think the first sales are due to complete in Cork hopefully by the end of the year. In terms of the legislative framework to allow that to happen, the Affordable Housing Act 21 has been adopted and has been commenced. There is regulations that are due to be issued under that by the end of this month to facilitate that, and we're working with the department on that actually to make sure that those initial schemes can proceed to sell units, etc., or sell homes rather. In terms of a larger scale delivery on it, I think it will take a little bit of time to ramp up in terms of kind of the volumes involved, but it certainly does facility to do it there, and the Affordable Housing Fund has been established by the department under Housing for All, and we've been again closely involved in the rollout of that, and that should start bearing fruit in the not too distant future.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I'm going to go backwards now and start with David, then Rachel, and then back to Jim. David, is there anything you'd like to say as a final word? Oh, when you're off mute. Great.
You think after a year and a half I'd have learned about mute buttons, but anyway, I suppose there are two things I'd say. I mean, there are a lot of measures in Housing for All, and a lot of those are very welcome. I think given the investment that's required in delivering housing, I think it's important that we get the detail behind those measures as quickly as possible to avoid uncertainty, and that uncertainty causing a pause within the system, because we need the housing. So I think avoiding that uncertainty and getting the detail is really important. And then and hopefully this isn't stealing from Rachel, but I think reform of the planning system and moving that forward as quickly as possible so that we get that pipeline coming through is really important. So they'd be my two messages.
Okay, thank you, David. Rachel?
Yeah, I think reform would be good. I think a bit of realism and realistic understanding of what is, I suppose, involved in it all would be helpful. I don't think that the LOD bill shows that, and that would be a concern going forward in respect of other potential legislation. So I think consultation and discussion with the practitioners is going to be key on top of resources and investment. We all want to provide a solution, but I am concerned that there be a gap between the end of one process and the start of another. So before we see anything from LOD, we're probably talking about 18 months anyway. So it'll be into 2023 before LOD delivers anything. So we have a long time to live with, I suppose, SHD and no permissions at all. And so I think that's a thing that needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Jim, last words to you.
I don't have any tremendously wise last words, but just one of the things that was brought up by David in his presentation was just the kind of the issue about the private sector being an important part of delivery, and sometimes being demonized as being almost a kind of a barrier to delivery, etc., and being greedy. Now, the private sector wants to make money, there's no doubt about that, but it is an essential part of delivering 33,000 houses a year. And without engaging with them and without facilitating them, we won't reach the target. So that's probably the last thing I'll say.
Okay, thanks, Jim. It just remains for me to thank our speakers very much, David, Rachel, and Jim. for their contributions today. And thank you very much for joining us. We had over 275, I think, at one stage on the call. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question, but I hope I got to a good selection of the different questions that were raised. Tomorrow we're on to Pathway 4, so I hope you can join us for that at 11:30 tomorrow. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.